Welcome back to David Roman. If you like clear, story-driven breakdowns of fast-moving events, take a second to subscribe right now, and after you finish listening, drop a comment with what stood out to you most, because I read them and they helped the channel get pushed to more people. Today's story is about something that, according to Ukrainian military leadership and multiple reports, has shifted the entire logic of the battlefield in one key region. The phrase being used is bold. The total liberation of Ukraine has begun, and the centerpiece of that claim is Dnipropetrovsk. We're told an all-out offensive has been underway, and that it has resulted in the near-complete liberation of territory Russia claimed to have captured in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. The implication is enormous. If this is accurate, then one of Vladimir Putin's most practical goals, building a defensive buffer that could choke off Ukrainian reinforcement routes, has been smashed apart right in front of him. Here's the core headline being repeated. Ukraine has liberated almost all of the territory Russia claimed in Dnipropetrovsk. That statement is attributed to Major General Alexander Komarenko, the head of the main operational directorate within Ukraine's general staff. In an interview dated March 10th, he reportedly said Ukraine had essentially completed the pushback in the region, leaving only final cleanup operations. Small settlements, small pockets, the kind of last resistance fragments that often remain after a frontline breaks. His quoted framing is simple and sharp. Almost the entire oblast has been liberated, and what remains is to finish work in 3 small settlements and clear 2 more. In other words, not a grand battle for the map anymore, but a systematic effort to remove the final pieces of an occupation footprint. If the last few weeks have taught observers anything, it's that once momentum flips, the end phase can move quickly, and that's especially true if the force that's losing ground has thin defenses, unclear coordination, and limited options besides retreat, concealment, or surrender. But the story gets bigger because this operation isn't being described as one lucky local counterpunch. It's being described as a sustained, deliberate campaign, weeks long, built to de-Russify an entire sector and erase the conditions Russia hoped to build for the next stage of war. According to reports that cite Euromaidan Press, Ukraine has carried out a high volume of offensive operations along what's called the Oleksandrivsk axis, a junction area between Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia. The significance of that junction is hard to overstate. If Russia could push into it and hold it, the terrain becomes something more than territory. It becomes leverage. It becomes a gate. It becomes a brake on Ukrainian movement. And that leads directly into the buffer zone idea. A buffer zone in this context isn't just a line on a map. It's a strip of controlled territory designed to slow reinforcements, delay counterattacks, and buy time. Time to build fortifications, time to rotate troops, time to prepare a larger offensive elsewhere. Russia's reported intent was to establish that buffer before larger spring-summer actions, so any Ukrainian support trying to move east would get stuck, chewed up, and forced to move under pressure. Ukraine's counteroffensive, as described by Komarenko and echoed in multiple write-ups, appears to have reversed that logic completely. Komarenko is said to claim Ukraine retook more than 400 square kilometers, around 154 square miles, and continued pressing to take more. Those numbers matter, but the follow-up matters even more. Reports describe Ukraine not only advancing, but then conducting sweeps, going back over liberated areas to remove infiltrating units, stragglers, and hidden pockets. That kind of follow-through is what turns a breakthrough into control. So how did Ukraine do it? According to commentary reported by outlets like the Kyiv Post, the operation is tied to combined aerial assault forces and ground assault units, with coordination that suggests planning rather than improvisation. Komarenko reportedly emphasized that this wasn't a spontaneous battle of the day. He described it as a planned offensive operation that passed approval procedures and coordination steps. He also made a broader point. Warfare is changing, and the content of operations and battles is changing with it. That line is important because it distinguishes this from the more common pattern of the last several years, where Ukraine might retake a village here, a patch of tree line there, an opportunistic correction when Russian positions overextend. What's being described in Dnipropetrovsk is different, a multi-week coordinated push aimed at clearing a region, then locking it down. And the reports add another detail that makes the operation feel even more methodical. Mechanized brigades already defending the sector reportedly joined the push, shifting from defensive posture to offensive action. That kind of transformation is not just tactical, it's psychological. It signals initiative, confidence, and a sense of timing, an ability to choose when to fight on your terms. The described logic is straightforward. Assault units push into contested or gray zone territory, clear and disrupt. Mechanized defenders then expand, stabilize, and reinforce what's gained, making the next advance easier. If you're picturing a door being kicked open, and then the whole frame being reinforced so it can't be kicked back in, you're close to the idea. Now the numbers. Komarenko's claim of 400 square kilometers is paired with another indicator, net territorial change. The Institute for the Study of War, in a March 3rd analysis that's been widely cited, reportedly noted something striking. February marked the first time since the summer 2023 counteroffensive that Ukraine retook more territory than Russia captured. ISW also reportedly cautioned that its methodology can underestimate Ukrainian advances because it waits for open source confirmation before declaring Russian positions lost. ISW's reported confirmed figures for mid to late February include a net Ukrainian gain of 33 square kilometers between February 14th and 20, and then a confirmed 57 square kilometer net gain between February 21 and 27. Whether you treat those as minimums or hard counts, the directional meaning is the same. The line moved the wrong way for Russia during a period where Russia wanted to be setting the stage for bigger operations. And as the narrative goes, once Russia's defenses cracked, Ukraine began shoring up a new front line. What was described as porous becoming filled with defenses and fortifications designed to make reversals far more costly. That brings us back to the buffer. Komarenko reportedly addressed it directly, saying Russian leadership constantly talks about needing the entire Donbas plus a buffer zone, and that their intention was to create that buffer specifically in Dnipropetrovsk. The logic from Moscow's perspective is cold and practical. Even if Russia could make progress in Donbass, the last thing it would want is Ukrainian counterstrikes punching toward the east through routes that remain open and reinforced. So the buffer zone is supposed to be the pause button. It's the delay. It's the time Russia buys to build walls behind the front. But the moment Ukraine dismantles that buffer, Russia's future gets harder in two directions at the same time. First, it gets harder to attack. Without a buffer, Ukrainian reinforcements can flow more freely toward threatened sectors, which means any planned Russian push has to fight a more supported defense. Second, it gets harder to hold. Without a buffer, any territory Russia hopes to consolidate becomes more vulnerable to counterattack pressure, because the distance that would slow Ukraine down no longer exists. Now we move into the momentum argument. Analysts quoted in reports, one name that comes up is Emil Kastahelmi of Finland's Blackbird Group, have suggested that in this sector, initiative has shifted to Ukraine over the last few weeks. That assessment is echoed by commentary that describes Ukraine weathering winter pressure on infrastructure and emerging with momentum, inflicting losses, receiving aid, fielding longer range capabilities, and proving it isn't the exhausted force Russian messaging tried to portray. And then there's the forward-looking element, 2026. The narrative here is that Russia has been preparing for a spring-summer offensive through sustained artillery pressure, drone strikes, and long-range attacks intended to stress logistics and energy systems. One proposed goal of that pressure would be to force Ukraine to commit reinforcements early before Ukraine wants to reveal where it's strong or where it's thin. But the counterclaim is that Ukraine's actions in Dnipropetrovsk have forced Russia into the very kind of diversion Russia wanted Ukraine to suffer. A military analyst often cited in this context, Alexander Kovalenko, is reported to have said that Russia's spring-summer plan appears aimed at pushing into the southern Donbas region along the Donetsk-Zaporizhzhia border, again, right around the Oleksandrivsk junction, while also moving toward the Donetsk fortress belt of cities, especially Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, to begin the effort of cracking the last major defensive line. However, even before the Dnipropetrovsk counteroffensive, reports suggest doubts that Russia can execute a full-scale campaign in that sector. And after Ukraine's described progress, the doubts only grow, because the buffer zone that was supposed to bog Ukraine down is being described as eliminated. So now imagine the map as a plan, not a picture. If Russia's plan depends on Ukrainian reinforcements being slowed, and that slowing mechanism is gone, then Russia has to choose between two bad options. Option 1, proceed anyway and risk attacking into a defense that can be strengthened faster than expected. Option 2, divert resources to rebuild what was lost, to recreate the buffer, to reopen the gate that Ukraine just slammed shut. Either option costs manpower, time, and political patience. And that leads to one more critical consequence: manpower chaos. There's a specific twist here. Russia's buffer strategy, as described, was meant to force Ukraine to divert more resources toward Dnipropetrovsk, thereby creating openings in Donbas. class. Instead, Ukraine used relatively small assault units, mechanized support, and drone swarms to conduct what's framed as a systematic search and destroy operation, retaking territory that, in this narrative, was only loosely held by small Russian infiltration groups. When that job is nearly complete, the tables turn. The claim is no longer that Ukraine must divert, it's that Russia must divert. Komarenko is reported to have said that pressure around places like Pokrovsk and Mir Nohorod decreased somewhat because Russian forces were redirected toward the Oleksandrivsk axis. In plain language, troops meant for Donetsk goals had to get pulled back toward an area Russia assumed it had already secured. That's the kind of reversal that doesn't just change a battle, it changes a calendar. It forces rescheduling, it forces improvisation, it forces sacrifice, because soldiers assigned to one mission are now being consumed by another. And if Russia is already struggling to generate the manpower needed for major offensives, then this kind of diversion becomes even more punishing. Reports have described Russia making increasingly desperate recruitment offers, including targeting vulnerable populations and offering substantial sums for service, which, whether you interpret it as shortage, political calculation, or both, does not look like the posture of a side that feels comfortable. So the larger story, as it's being told, is this. Ukraine identifies a weak point where Russia's control is thinner than advertised. Ukraine strikes with coordinated combined forces. Ukraine retakes territory rapidly enough to flip net change for a month. Ukraine then consolidates with follow-on sweeps. Russia's buffer concept collapses. Russia must divert troops away from its Donetsk priorities. Russia's spring-summer plan becomes harder to execute, both tactically and logistically. And all of this happens while Ukraine is described as becoming more efficient at attrition and deep strike pressure. Now I want to bring you into the conversation with two audience questions, and I want you to answer them in the comments so I can feature the strongest takes in a future narration. Question 1. Do you think the buffer zone strategy can actually decide the fate of a larger offensive in Donbass? Question 2. If Russia is forced to choose, where do you think it concentrates first? Rebuilding the buffer around the Oleksandrivsk junction, or pushing hard at the Donetsk fortress belt? As we close, remember what makes this story so tense. It's not just territory, it's the removal of a future plan. A buffer zone is supposed to be the silent weapon, space that slows, space that bleeds, space that delays. If that space disappears, then timelines collapse. And when timelines collapse in war, mistakes multiply. If you want more narrations like this, structured, detailed, and paced so you can follow the logic without needing anything on screen, make sure you're subscribed to David Roman. And again, leave a comment with your answers to those two questions, plus any detail you want me to break down next.